globally, we might review 10 or 15 different places on Earth a day that is having some kind of flood event. We can't do all of them at once yet. so like, what is the most important one? What is the one that can provide the most insight to a community or to a customer or whatever the case is?
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Shay Strong. She is the Vice President of Analytics at a company called ICEYE, and today on the podcast we're talking about using synthetic aperture radar to monitor flooding and why it's not quite as easy as you might think. So Shay's going to talk around some of the challenges there. What do we need to do to create a model, a process that can accurately and consistently do this, monitor flooding, and give the kinds of analytics we need, and also what it takes to sell a process like this. How do we market it? How do we go out to the market and say, hey, we've got this piece of geospatial magic, please buy it? If synthetic aperture radar or SAR is new to you and you want to know a little bit more about what it actually is and what it does, go back into the podcast archive and look for an episode called Introduction to Synthetic Aperture Radar. And I think this will give you a really good sort of basic understanding of what the technology is and what it can do. Hi Shay, welcome to the podcast. I'm really looking forward to this. We're going to be talking about SAR data and we're going to talk about flooding and why it's a difficult thing to, monitor flooding using SAR. But I think before we dive into all those kinds of interesting stuff, perhaps you could just take the time to introduce yourself to the audience, maybe give us an idea of where you are now in terms of your career, how you got there, and we'll head off into the main topic from there.
Sounds good. Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Let's see, I'm Shay Strong. I'm the Vice President of Analytics at ICEYE. It's a relatively new role for me. I guess I'm coming up on my year anniversary. So I joined last November during COVID. But I guess in general, SAR is very new to me, and ICEYE is all about SAR. But really, before that, I came from an astrophysics background. So I got my PhD at the University of Texas in Austin, focusing on climatological studies of gas giant planets. And quite honestly, I had a pretty bad graduate school experience. I think I would say just maybe unmotivating and not a really good support group there. So I think I kind of came out of that wondering what else there was. I mean, I think there's a lot of value in research for research's sake, but I think for me, I was looking for something more, maybe something more timely and applied. And conveniently had a grad student office mate who got a job at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab in Baltimore in the US. And she helped me get my foot in the door there. And I got to join a great team there working on developing national security space satellites and systems. Really good experience from kind of transitioning from this more academic community to a real world solution and solving critical problems for specific applications. But then I was there for maybe 7 or so years, and I think my experience with kind of in that government contract space and government projects can be really hard for early career people to come in with really interesting, novel, agile ideas. I think there's a lot of legacy, and maybe rightfully so, but it's a bit of a challenge. And so I was looking for a new transition, and I joined my first ever startup in Washington, D.C. called OmniEarth. And this was 2014, and I became the first data scientist out of that org. And it was like around this time when the world was really salivating over data scientists. And quite honestly, I had no clue what a data scientist was. But come to find out, it's exactly what I tried to sell myself as leaving grad school. Like, I can compute things, and I can write code, and I can analyze data, and I can do observations. And really, that turns out to be a data scientist. And so I built that team there in DC, really focused on creating a solution around predicting water usage in the US, like very focused on southwestern part of the US. So using satellite and aerial imagery. And at the time, of course, like TensorFlow was being open source. There was a lot of great new deep learning research, and we were able to create some really nice cloud-based pipelines to extract information about land use, land cover, and then project water usage. And this turned out to be a really cool solution that targeted a specific need. And then that was a big success. And the company got acquired, and I moved over from Washington, D.C. across the US to Seattle and joined a company called EagleView that was more focused on aerial imagery acquisitions, but also interested in these applied use cases of, how can you use imagery to extract meaningful information for insurance or government? And I was there for a period of time, build out a team of roughly maybe 40 plus people, kind of between India and the US. And I got this amazing call that ICEYE was interested in speaking with me, and I was a little bit confused first over who ICEYE was and what they were trying to do. But the more I learned, the more I just got incredibly excited and motivated to join their team in Finland. So that was a pretty dramatic move for me, and that circles me back to here and now, and located in Finland and working to build the team at ICEYE on the solutions and analytics side.
Wow, you have come a really long way. Would you mind just briefly clarifying for us what is ICEYE? What do they do?
Yes, yeah. I mean, ICEYE is a really interesting company. So foundationally, it's a synthetic aperture radar satellite company. So build and launch a constellation of small SAR satellites. So these are less than 100 kilograms in mass system. So very agile, very small, relatively inexpensive. And the cool thing about ICEYE is that the founders came out of like right out of university. Literally, the office is still on the university campus, and the founders they were the first to ever miniaturize the SAR technology required for this domain. And incredibly novel because historically, like SAR has been around a while. I think you've definitely had other speakers comment to this previously, but well back into the 50s, like the technology's been there. It's been very government centric, but it's been big, it's been massive. And so the founders, revolutionized the engine on the engineering side. We are now at a constellation of 14 small sats that are operational today in space. And then now, like where that leaves us as an organization is like we don't want to just sell data, sell pixels, sell images. I mean, I think that has a very specific market, but it can be a bit limiting. And then, going to the other end of like, well, how can we better use the data to create solutions and essentially information that is useful in very specific avenues? So coming back to insurance and government, I think there's a lot of really historic use cases and needs there that are kind of built in rather static workflows that, I mean, to use the overused word of disrupted, like there is a need for a bit of disruption here in terms of how can data better serve these end users in a way that reduces bias and scales the types of workflows and information that they find valuable, and also on the customer side, like builds trust between them and their customers. I think a lot of these processes are very subjected to just manual bias and uncertainty. So there's this big space that we just kind of collectively call solutions, and then there's this big opportunity with a bunch of imagery collected from these SAR satellites. And then my job is how do we fuse those two, and how can we make something valuable and useful and timely?
You talked about not wanting to just sell pixels. So you're going to sell analysis or solutions or answers, I guess. I know that one of the things you're looking into is monitoring flooding. But I know also from a previous conversation that this is not as easy as someone like me might think. I'm wondering if you could talk us through that process. Why is it so difficult to monitor flooding?
Yeah, and I mean that's a really great question. I guess going back to like there's this maybe another time, another conversation. There's this whole domain of SAR versus optical versus infrared. There's all these different modes in which you can observe the Earth, right? They're different wavelengths. And if we look at flood, so specifically, essentially any kind of natural catastrophe, there's a couple of really interesting characteristics. They're often they often happen very fast, and it's a time series event. So for floods, I mean, it can be as fast as a flash flood that kind of happens in an hour or a couple of hours, all the way to like maybe a multi-week situation where a region is just inundated. So it's very much a time series event. But even beyond that, wildfires, those are also very time series events, and so there's this constant change. And then if we now like try to marry like how can I as a user of this information, if I wanted to understand regionally where were the regions that were most impacted, where were the structures or the houses or the buildings or the roads that were the most damaged, how can I observe that? And then so now we can get married to satellites, so remote sensing. Can we observe these situations? And the advantage that SAR has is that, especially like on the ICEYE side, these are microwave radar satellites. So being an active system, we can use this system day and night, and we can also penetrate through atmospheric contamination like weather, clouds, smoke, haze, all these things. And so now, like to capture the time series domain of these different situations, like SAR becomes really beneficial in ways that traditional optical or infrared are really challenged, where they can't see through clouds or haze or smoke. So there's a nice marrying of the data source to the need of just understanding the impact. But then there's a lot of additional compounding factors of like, well, imaging it isn't good enough. You still have to do a lot of additional data assimilation, and you need ground truthing, and you need ways like you can't just invent a solution. You also have to figure out how to ingest it into a customer's workflow, and how to make them use it. So there's a lot of these additional components that come out of that later on.
So you talked about this idea of not wanting to just sell pixels. You want to sell something else. Perhaps you want to do some analytics on top of the data you're collecting. Maybe you want to supply an answer to the user, to the customer. What does that mean in terms of flooding? So when you think about monitoring flooding, what do you have to do to be able to monitor flooding, to be able to provide that end answer to someone who's asking the question, is flooding happening here and how much is happening here?
That's a great question, and I think as it turns out, it's a pretty complicated one to answer, and I think we're still learning. But going from just pixels, where there's already rather complex information, especially from a radar image, to going to deliver a solution like where was the flood and how deep was the flood, like turns out to be this pretty big journey. And so what we do today is we have a large team that mobilizes around identifying like where do we think a flood will happen. And I think this is like represented fundamentally a big inflection point for us, where last year we had kind of the mindset of like, oh, we'll wait for somebody to task us. We'll wait for somebody to say that they're interested in a city or a location. But it turns out like people always like take too long to get to that. And by the time they actually say they're interested in something, like we've missed the event or we've missed the opportunity to provide insight. And so how we got in front of that is by creating this pretty comprehensive solution, which involves meteorologists, it involves ops and analysts, and it involves machine learning. But fundamentally, the first part is pull in a bunch of third-party data about weather, forecasts, population, and then get kind of situational awareness of where a flood might happen. And then, once we have that information to our best knowledge, we can, conveniently, we own the constellation of 14 satellites. So we can say, okay, automatically go task these locations and target this time frame. We think the peak of the event based on precipitation or whatever the situation is. We think the event will happen at this time. And then there's a little bit of a finger crossing, like you do hope that you capture the peak. The intent with the peak capture is like, that's hopefully more or less the deepest flood. I think we constantly learn new things, so that's not always the case, but you really hope you have the most amount of information you can have for that situation. And then we can start an activation process where it's a semi-automated approach, which does require like probably way more on the manual side right now than on the automated side. But it's a process that like within 24 hours of that peak capture, we have to turn around what is the flood extent and what is the flood depth. And it turns out that information is really important in those first 24 hours for whether it's government response. So like in the US with FEMA, for instance, being able to send the right kind of assets or help in situations, or maybe an insurance carrier that's trying to assess, the damage for the clients that they have. And so that's where we are today. And constantly trying to figure out how can we be faster and more strategic about what we're doing and the types of data that we're leveraging, because it's not just SAR, it turns out. SAR is useful, of course, as a foundational layer because of the being able to see through clouds and have kind of a persistent monitoring capability. But you also need a lot of other things, a lot of other, you need building information, you need digital terrain maps, and that together creates this comprehensive solution.
Could you talk about the role of these other things, the DTMs that you were talking about, the building information? What does that mean for you in terms of figuring out if there's a flood and how deep it is?
Yeah, I mean, it turns out that the high quality digital terrain maps are like imperative to get that three-dimensional aspect of the flood depth. And in fact, like I mean, maybe even taking a step back, like any SAR product where you need to take a pixel from a SAR image and geo-register it to a point on the Earth, like is only as good as the DTM, really. And then it turns out like DTMs are really expensive, especially good ones. And many different countries, and sometimes, within a country, there might be multiple different organizations that acquire this data and they can, resell it. Sometimes it's open source, but it's just everybody's different. Every country's different. And, finding that, curating that, organizing it and making it efficiently queryable is one of the biggest headaches that we have. And so putting a lot of infrastructure around finding the best data is one of the really important bits. And from a fundamental level, the terrain map itself is giving you the information as to like what is the gradient of the earth, like how steep or how shallow is it. And as we start generating flood output, like if we suddenly are presented with a digital terrain map that's maybe 30 meters in resolution, there's each cell, each pixel in that digital terrain map can be, cover a 30-meter area. And if you're talking about now putting that cell in the middle of a city, there's a huge amount of variability that could happen, especially if there happens to be a lot of hills or a lot of mountainous areas or valleys or whatever the case is. And so you can imagine when you try to then model flood or you try to then map those features onto that Earth surface, like there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty in general. And so again, this is one of the most important data sources that we have. And then buildings, of course, I think there's so many amazing open source building data sets now, even in the last just 2 or 3 years. But still, one of the greatest unsolved mysteries, I think, of the geospatial world is like getting all these different data layers to fall in the right place on Earth at the same time. I think there's always this co-registration, what we call a co-registration problem, and nobody solved it.
At the risk of using a really bad pun, so let's say we had the perfect storm. Let's say we had you survived the logistic nightmare, which I'm sure tasking satellites can be. So you're trying to find a slot in your schedule. Where do we have capacity to take an image of this flood? And that's assuming that you can accurately predict where the flood is going to happen, where this peak flood event is going to be on the world, that you can point your SAR sensor towards it and capture an image of it. And I guess that's also assuming that you have all these data sets available so you can begin processing and trying to determine if the flood is happening and if it's the peak event that you're hoping to capture. How do you ground truth that?
Ground truthing is definitely a huge challenge. And right now, like I mean, I think there are very reliable sources in certain locations. So river gauges or tidal gauges even can give you those in situ observations of what was the depth or the water height at this point at this time. But the caveat is that it's always already in a body of water. So where we really need the ground truth is in the city streets or on a building or in other places where water is not normally found. And often what we result to is developing a social media pipeline that goes and does a huge amount of open source data pulling, whether that's just Google searching first of all, or YouTube videos, or honestly TikTok, or anything where anybody has posted some kind of evidence of flood. And we have a workflow spun up to use that information as an auxiliary kind of ground truth data point. But as you can imagine, like if you think about opening a YouTube video where somebody has captured flooding in their street, you have to geolocate that information and you have to timestamp that information because, by the way, none of that information is usually available with these data sources. And so there's, still a lot of opportunity for uncertainty and bias. So I think it's safe to say there's often not ground truth, or it's okay. It's something that we can point to, but it is a big challenge. And that's actually an area that we're also interested in exploring, of like how can we, maybe there's another network of sensors that we could create and deploy to help improve the ground control points for some of these solutions.
You hit the nail on the head here. I was just thinking of this, another network. And I'm thinking a great network would be the people that are already there. And so the idea of the human in the loop. So you've made all these really smart estimates. We think it's going to happen here. We have the data to create the analysis we're interested in. And this is all automated. And I can see that the attraction here is the scale that you could achieve with this, I guess. But do you think this is going to totally remove the humans? Like, could you imagine a situation where you could contact that person on social media or contact people in the village and say, hey, look, I think there's flooding happening. Could you verify that? Do you even see a place for humans in this loop?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a brilliant question. Like, I think we can never get rid of humans in this loop. And it's funny, like, to be completely transparent, like not too long ago, joining some of these startups where the investors only wanted to hear about automation. Like, oh, you're going to build a machine learning team and automate everything. And now we can, reduce this labor force entirely and scale things up, many orders of magnitude. And that's fundamentally not how it works. It just doesn't. And I would honestly you know, pose a provocative thought. Like, I would love to see where that has actually been a success, because I don't think you can get rid of the human. I think there's ways to augment the workflow and the solution to make it maybe more efficient and effective, and switch how you use humans. But especially coming back to flood, I think having that subject matter expertise is imperative. And I have this dream world. Like, honestly, it starts feeling like I'm just reinventing things that already exist, like OpenStreetMap, or there's so many other open source communities where people are providing information from apps and basically doing crowdsourcing. But this world of where we could just have a very specific ICEYE app that's just like, hey, at this point, give us, we'll take your lat long if it's okay with you, and we can measure the depth right now. And by the way, cell phones have come a long way, so you can pretty easily use the embedded sensor technology in phones that are pretty ubiquitous at this point, and kind of get a better measurement than what we're doing. And that just opens up an amazing capability. I think the challenge is then if you build a workflow based on humans and based on their input, or weighting that workflow substantially on the human input, you are kind of subjected to the whim of the humans. And I think that's the scary part of having humans in the loop. But how can you reliably scale or use those resources and knowledge effectively? And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but I do think it's a critical part. And it's something that we definitely recognize, and it's honestly going to differentiate the types of solutions that we can provide versus what others have already tried.
So please don't misunderstand me here. Like, I'm really excited about this kind of technology. I see it providing a lot of answers and maybe even generating a lot more questions, when we can do this kind of thing on a regular basis and know that it's working. Again, really, really excited about it. Who is the incumbent here? So is it the humans? Is it, a human going down to the river and saying, yes, it's flooding? Because I guess that's how we've been doing it for a long time. Is that still what's happening now? Is this the competition that a system, a technology like what you're building is facing? Or are we solving two very, very different problems here?
I don't think it's different. I mean, I think they're very complementary, and I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this. I mean, part of it is that's essentially what some of these organizations are doing now, right? They, after an event happens, a flood, for lack of other events, they send a group of people out to go try to estimate where was the deepest flood, which properties had the most impact. And usually, I would say, most of this assessment happens after the fact. I mean, hopefully people are evacuated during these events, and so there's probably not as much real time info as there could be. And then I think where we're trying to get with a solution is how can we expedite that information and broaden it so that you're not maybe reliant on a dozen people wading their way through kind of a disaster strewn urban environment, but rather let's bring the perspective, and then speed up how we respond to that. And so I think there's an opportunity where the two can definitely benefit from each other, and it's how can we leverage that effectively in a way that makes sense, and capitalize on the information that boots on the ground could provide, but maybe go a little bit faster, or look beyond where humans have access to, if that makes sense.
So let's assume again that the stars aligned and you could task the satellites, you had all the data that you needed, everything worked out fine. You collected the data at peak flood. It was brilliant. What would the output of that be? Would you be able to measure like the depth at different places in the flood, in the water body? What kind of spatial resolution can we expect in terms of how detailed can you map the edge of the water? That kind of thing.
So our product today is a three-dimensional product. So it's the latitude, longitude, extent, and then it's the depth that is really driven by that underlying terrain model. And then in terms of resolution, we really want to push the resolution to be as close to our highest resolution SAR product as possible. So our highest resolution spotlight mode, for instance, is 0.25 meters per pixel. And So relatively high resolution, enough to get a lot of information about a specific structure or differentiate structures from each other. And then like, where we want to go with this is like, well, we have the SAR as that quantifiable imagery layer where we can send people to validate or we can take measurements to validate. And where like there's an interesting opportunity to push that even further with like starting to incorporate hydrological modeling or other ways to kind of analyze how does the event change over time. So how does that depth vary and how granular can you go in terms of your accuracy with that? And I think there's a lot of questions we don't have the answers to. One of the things we struggle a lot with, especially on the resolution, is, we have clients who they sit in countries, many, many time zones removed from us, and they kind of have a limit of what they consider flood and around 40 45 centimeters, like flood no flood. I mean it's a rather kind of binary assessment, and there's a lot of uncertainty that comes into play at say 40 centimeters. Like if somebody had put on their property a flood defense, like some kind of wall or some kind of garden structure, who knows what, like a slight step or patio, like that's enough to detract or discourage 40 centimeters worth of water. And what we struggle with is like the desire for information is at that level. If somebody walked out of that house, would you be right at 40 centimeters? And then, from our perspective, well, we can't tell you what flood defenses people have from, orbit around the earth. That's a bit of a challenge. And how do we meet in the middle and drive closer to that answer? And I think that's something we're still trying to figure out.
Is that something you could also incorporate into your models? Like when you're trying to determine if a flood event is going to happen, I guess there must also be some sort of estimation about the severity of that expected event, and perhaps combining that with, okay, well, what do we know? We could look at the topography, for example, and say that in itself could be, a flood protection mechanism, and start making sort of assumptions like we are only interested in capturing things that we think are going to be significant, or this community has already said this is significant for us. 50 centimeters of water lying everywhere is significant.
There's a lot of content in there to unpack. I think one of the things that we've been wrestling with is, exactly the point of, is it worth activating against? I mean, like as I mentioned a little bit earlier, like this process comes with a significant labor cost. Like, we can automate parts of it, but not everything. And so there's still a lot of humans in the loop. And so, when we look at, globally, we might review 10 or 15 different places on Earth a day that is having some kind of flood event. We can't do all of them at once yet. so like, what is the most important one? What is the one that can provide the most insight to a community or to a customer, or whatever the case is? There's some interesting locations in India, for instance, which flood relatively regularly, like through the monsoon season, and it in essence become like a way of life for people. Like there's just an expectation that annually or multiple times a year you're going to have these massive raging floods through the city environments. And then, taking a step back and figuring out, well, like, so is our assessment of a flood in a region like that is more or less mentally prepared for it, is that valuable versus maybe another community that is less prepared or is very flash flood prone and doesn't have the defenses to respond to it effectively from a humanitarian aspect? I don't know that there's a good solution here. I mean, I think unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not sure. We have to make money, at some level. Like we have to figure out who's going to buy it. Like, there's a huge value here, obviously, for, a kind of a broader humanitarian aspect. But at the end of the day, we do kind of have to balance that with paying salaries. And so, looking at the spread of all of these different events and where do we think the market would be interested in consuming that information versus like where is it just like critical to tackle? And we literally have stand-ups and stand-downs every single day that are supposed to be like 15 minutes long, and inevitably they become a bit of these, I would say, jovial, combative, what we should do. And it just, I think, is a reflection of where we are as we are evolving with this process.
Let's talk about this. Who's buying this thing? Because it seems to me that you have this immensely complicated but exciting process, right? And I'm sure that you're going to continue to refine things, make it better, speed up the process, that kind of thing. So, first question, who's buying it? And is it difficult to sell it to them? Because I guess you're showing up with a pocket full of magic and saying, here, I can do this. Like how does that work?
This is like the story of my professional career. And I I think like I mean if I can see like at ICEYE, if we can be successful such that we start having recurring clients where we basically take an analytics driven product and turn it into a fully scalable production solution. Like I feel like I could retire a happy woman. but but like that is such a challenge, and I also like maybe fighting words, I'm sure, in different domains. I don't think it's been done yet successfully, short of maybe recommending movies or recommending shoes to buy or whatever the case is. And so, when I look at our flood solution today, we're targeting government first responders and we're targeting insurance. And there's a huge potential need there. And we even get that. Like I would say we're kind of in this limited release phase of the development that we've done of the methodology, where we're working really closely with several handpicked insurance clients that are very invested in this, and so much so that it's a challenge, because on one hand it's exciting that they're helping drive some of the technology development and that they're super invested, but on the other hand they do want us to conform to their previous mindsets. And I think like we often get in these situations where at the end of the day they're comparing us to claims, which can be a big challenge because we can't predict who's going to claim damage happened. For all the reasons I mentioned earlier, like there might be a flood defense we don't know about, or maybe somebody didn't pay their bill and therefore they don't want to file a claim. We don't know. There's a psychological aspect to it. And when we're working with some of these clients, they're very much focused on like what was the reality. For them, the reality is who filed a claim, and to take an analytics product and validate it against that. We get in these very circular discussions that are a challenge to bridge the gap. And I do still think there's a tremendous market there. I think we're getting traction, but the adoption, the customer adoption and customer integration will be the biggest challenge, and will probably be, I don't know, to use the weird and like the longest pole. Like developing the technology, like, oh, we can grasp, we can evolve, we can iterate, we got a handle on, but like getting people to use it, getting it in their system, and getting them to consistently purchase it, that is the big problem.
It's really interesting. That was going to be my next question. So I see a lot of these problems as, if you had to split them up into two very broad buckets, perhaps you could say a technical problem and a cultural problem. And I was going to ask, if I could solve one of those problems for you, which one would it be? And it sounds like you would solve the cultural problem because you're confident that you'll get there with the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the cultural, and then cultural is like super weighted. Like it's cultural from a industry perspective. Like I think, well, in the US, I mean, insurance has kind of had these processes in place for 30, 40 years. I'm not sure about, other countries, but you're competing with cultural mindsets that are just very like kind of baked in everybody's career that's there now. And so there's that aspect, and then there's the cultural side of just like how do different clients in these, largely insurance or government, like from a literal cultural perspective, what is important to them? Is it saving money? Is it more about customer like retention, or making their customers happy, or by being fast? Like culturally, like what is important to them as an institution, as a society, from a business perspective, and all those things. If everything was just technical, like that would be way easier.
Spoken like a true data scientist. And so other people are in the situation, right? So they've got this amazing piece of technology and they're confident it's either in a place now where it's production ready, or they can get it to a place where it's production ready, where it can solve a very real problem. And now they're facing that cultural, that marketing problem. If you had to give those people some advice, what would you say to them, like based on your experience?
Yeah, what would I say to them? I mean, I think the big thing is, find a friend in the market that you're trying to go into. I think, I've worked with some really brilliant organizations that have developed killer apps from a technology perspective. Like they've made these beautiful platforms, or they've made these beautiful cloud pipelines that are super effective and super, efficient. But then at the end of the day, like nobody's using the data because it's not answering the right questions. or there, it just leaves a lot open. And so I really do think it's about building thoughtfulness and expertise specific to that domain. And maybe that means like hiring insurance or government people as part of your organization, but just I don't know, like finding an opportunity to sit down and really get to know. Maybe maybe people do this already, but I think fundamentally that's still somehow missing. Like or maybe still going after things that are sexy and exciting. When you think about all the beautiful platforms that people are kind of promoting around, queering the earth and making the earth searchable, and it tells a beautiful marketing story. It's easy to open a web browser and look at imagery and kind of, you equate it to Google searching and suddenly like, oh, there has to be tons of use cases. But the reality of it is like that alone doesn't address anything. It doesn't necessarily address a need. And so it's getting like really getting in cozy with the domain that you're going after and being specific. Stop being so broad. Like I think not every problem is a big data problem or a big scale problem. Sometimes it's smaller scale in terms of what you're targeting that can then lead you to solving bigger problems.
Shay, I really want to thank you for your time. I love the way you show up. I can feel the excitement when I talk to you, and it's just yeah, it's just magical talking to you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate talking to people that are simply so passionate about what they do. It's great. If somebody's listening to this and they think, how can I reach out to Shay? How can I get in touch with ICEYE? How can I follow along with what they're up to? Where should they go to be able to do that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Twitter, I would argue, is maybe the best to reach me. So Shay Be Strong at Twitter, and then we of course have a web presence, an ICEYE web presence. But I think Twitter again is is the good result. I think that's where like the interesting pieces of information come out. It moves it away a little bit from the salesy side and maybe makes it more tangible. So that's what I would advocate for.
Thanks again for your time. I love talking with you.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. Definitely the best interviewer I've ever had.
Woohoo! So I really hope you enjoyed that discussion with Shay Strong from ICEYE. I'll put a link to her Twitter profile in the show notes to make it a little bit easier for you to find. So I have to say I really enjoyed this conversation with Shay. I really like understanding about how these processes work, the different steps that involve. So I tend to focus on the technical side of things because, again, I'm fascinated by it. I find it really, really interesting. But more and more, I'm getting equally interested in the business side of it. So great, so we've got this amazing technology. How do we sell it? Is it actually going to make a difference? Are people going to buy it? And I really appreciate Shay's open and honest discussion around that side of it. And interesting enough, it wasn't the technical challenges that Shay was facing, and there are a lot of them. She was confident that her and her team at ICEYE, they can solve those challenges, they can move forward. It was the cultural challenge that Shay described as being that long pull, as the hardest bit of this. And I guess if we sort of zoom in a little bit, the cultural challenge was bringing change to the market, asking people to change. So asking people change is one thing, and of course we've all heard that saying, no one got fired for buying IBM. And you could just as well say you are more likely to get fired for taking a risk, for being open to change. So I think we understand that there is a risk involved with change, with innovation, with doing something new. But I think there's something else here too, and I think it's the understanding of what is it people are buying, what do they actually want. So when I listen to people like Shay, people that are building amazing, innovative products and technologies and services, firstly, I'm completely blown away. But when I hear her talk about the challenges of bringing this to market, understanding what it is people are actually going to put money on the table and say, yes, I will have some of that. I can't help but wonder if we are in the business of selling cars to people that are actually looking for faster horses. And if we are, well, that might be okay. I mean, it worked out really, really well for the Ford Motor Company. I just hope that Shay and pioneers like Shay take a deep breath. I hope they make it work. I hope they keep pushing forward. I think it would be fantastic to have some examples out there where we could point to and say, hey, look, it's working over there. I wonder if we had enough great examples of this working in the wild, if we might end up in a situation where companies and organizations and industries were eager to change as opposed to needing to be convinced to change. That's it for me. That's it for another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. It's much appreciated. If you have any questions, comments, you want to reach out to me for whatever reason, feel free to do so. You can find me on social media at Mapscaping on Twitter, and there'll be a link to my LinkedIn profile in the show notes of this episode. Otherwise, If email is your thing, info@mapscaping, send me a thoughtful email. I will send you a thoughtful response. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. See you next week. Bye.